The Hamilton Corporation Charity Gala blazed with 1,000 lights. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen stars above a ballroom filled with power wealth and carefully measured smiles. Emma Turner stood in the corner, 14 years old, trembling hands, gripping a silver tray of champagne flutes. Her mother's uniform hung slightly loose on her small frame. She didn't belong here. Everyone knew it. The orchestra shifted into a waltz, slow and haunting. A man in a black suit stepped onto the dance floor alone. Tall, silent, untouchable. The crowd parted around him like water around stone. No one approached. No one dared. Emma's heart hammered. She saw something in his stance, the way he stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something that would never come. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "Politeness and kindness will take you places money never could." She set the tray down. Her hand steadied. One step, then another. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. She stopped before him, curtsied the way she'd practiced in secret, and lifted her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she whispered, her voice small but clear. "May I have this dance?" The music didn't stop, but everything else did. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. The man looked down at her. His eyes were cold, sharp, surprised. He was Alexander Hamilton, billionaire, CEO, the man who owned everything in this room. And she had just asked him to dance. Before you find out what happens next, take a guess. Is this girl being foolish, or is she about to do the bravest thing of her life? Emma Turner had lived in the shadows of the Hamilton estate for as long as she could remember. She was 14 now, but she'd been 10 when her mother Martha first brought her to the servants' quarters, a small room tucked behind the kitchen with a narrow window that looked out onto the garden. It wasn't much, but it was home. Martha had worked for the Hamilton family for nearly a decade. She was kind, patient, and invisible. The kind of woman who could clean a room so quietly you'd never know she'd been there. She taught Emma the same way. "Keep your head down, sweetheart," her mother would say, folding laundry by lamplight. "Be polite, be respectful, and remember, kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything." Emma tried. She really did. But there was one thing she couldn't keep quiet, couldn't keep hidden. She loved to dance. Every evening after the floors were mopped and the dishes were stacked, Emma would turn on the old radio in the corner of their room. Static would crackle, then fade, and soft music would fill the air. She'd close her eyes and spin. No partner, no audience, just her, the music, in the dream of something more. Sometimes when the grand ballroom upstairs hosted events, Emma would sneak to the doorway and watch through the crack. She'd see women in gowns that shimmered like moonlight, men in tailored suits gliding across polished floors. She studied their steps, the way they held each other, the way they moved like water, like wind, like something weightless. She taught herself every turn, every pivot, every graceful dip. Her mother caught her once twirling alone in the hallway at midnight. Martha didn't scold her. She just smiled, sad and soft, and said, "One day, Emma, one day someone will see you the way you deserve to be seen." Emma held on to that promise like a lifeline. Then came the night of the annual Hamilton Charity Gala. Martha had been sick all week, a fever that wouldn't break, a cough that rattled in her chest. She tried to push through, but by the afternoon she could barely stand. "I can do it, Mama," Emma had said, pulling on the uniform. "I've watched you 100 times. I know what to do." Martha hesitated, her tired eyes filled with worry. But they needed the work. They couldn't afford to say no. "Just stay quiet," Martha whispered, gripping Emma's hand. "Serve the drinks. Don't make eye contact. And whatever you do, don't draw attention to yourself." Emma nodded. But the moment she stepped into that ballroom, everything changed. It was like stepping into a different world. The ceiling arched high above her, painted with clouds and angels. Chandeliers dripped with crystal and gold. The floor gleamed like ice, reflecting the swirl of silk and satin. Music floated through the air, rich and warm. Emma had seen it before, but only through cracks in doors, only in stolen glances. Now she was inside it, and it was breathtaking, but it was also cold. The guests moved through the room like actors on a stage, their smiles bright and empty. They spoke in voices that sounded rehearsed, calculated. They looked at the servers the way you'd look at furniture necessary but not worth noticing. Emma carried her tray carefully, weaving between conversations she wasn't meant to hear. A woman in diamonds laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. A man in a gray suit snapped his fingers at a server demanding another drink without a single word of thanks. Another girl barely older than Emma stumbled while carrying glasses. One tipped spilling red wine onto the marble floor. The guest she'd been serving didn't flinch. He simply looked down at her with disgust and walked away. The girl scrambled to clean it up, her face burning with shame. No one helped her. Emma's chest tightened. This was the world her mother had warned her about. Beautiful on the surface, cruel beneath. But Emma didn't look away. She kept her head up. She kept her smile gentle. Because she believed she had to believe that kindness still mattered. That respect was something you gave freely, not something you earned through money or status. Her mother had taught her that. And tonight, for the first time, Emma would prove it. She just didn't know how yet. Alexander Hamilton was 45 years old, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Not as a CEO, not as a billionaire, not as the man whose signature could change lives with a single stroke of a pen. Just seen. He stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, watching the crowd move around him like a current he no longer belonged to. It had been 2 years since Catherine died. 2 years since the car accident that took her on a rainy October night. 2 years since he'd danced with anyone. He used to love it. The music, the movement, the way Catherine would rest her head on his shoulder and whisper that everything would be okay, even when the world felt too heavy. Now the ballroom felt like a museum. Beautiful, empty, full of things he could no longer touch. People kept their distance. They always did now. Not out of respect, out of fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of reminding him of what he'd lost. Fear of seeing the cracks beneath the surface. So they smiled from across the room. They raised their glasses. They kept him at arm's length, and Alexander let them. The orchestra began a waltz. Soft, slow, familiar. Catherine's favorite. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memory wash over him. Then he opened them again and stepped onto the dance floor. Alone. He didn't know why. Maybe because it hurt less to stand in the open than to hide in the corners. Maybe because he wanted to prove he could still do it, stand in the center of the room and not shatter. The crowd shifted away from him, a silent acknowledgement of his solitude. No one dared approach. No one would risk the rejection. And then a small voice, clear, gentle. "Excuse me, sir. May I have this dance?" Alexander looked down. A girl stood before him, 14, maybe 15, too young to be a guest, wearing a server's uniform that didn't quite fit. Her eyes were wide, nervous, but steady. She wasn't mocking him. She wasn't performing for the crowd. She was just asking. The ballroom went silent. Whispers hissed through the air like steam. "Is that the maid's daughter? What is she doing? Someone stop her." Alexander stared at her. His first instinct was to say no, to turn away, to retreat back into the armor he'd built around himself. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she stood there trembling but brave. Maybe it was the fact that she'd done what no one else in this room had the courage to do. Or maybe it was because she looked at him like he was a person, not a monument. He set his glass down on a passing tray. "All right," he said quietly, "but don't let me step on your feet." Her face lit up. He took her hand. It was small, cold, shaking slightly. He placed his other hand gently on her shoulder the way he'd done 1,000 times before. The music swelled, and they began to move. At first, Emma was stiff. She counted the steps in her head, terrified of making a mistake. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But Alexander guided her with patience, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her time to follow. "Relax," he murmured. "You're doing fine." Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing steadied. And suddenly she wasn't just surviving the dance. She was dancing. The ballroom blurred around them. The chandeliers became streaks of gold. The guests faded into shadows. It was just the two of them moving through space like they were the only people left in the world. Emma's fear melted away. She felt light, free. For the first time in her life, she wasn't invisible. And Alexander felt something crack open inside his chest. Not pain, not grief. Something else. Something warm. He looked down at the girl in his arms and realized she was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile of the crowd. A real smile, full of wonder. When was the last time someone had smiled at him like that? The music slowed. The final notes hung in the air like a question. They stopped in the center of the floor, still holding each other. Emma stepped back, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. She curtsied just as she had before. "Thank you, sir." Alexander didn't move. He just looked at her, this small, brave girl who had stepped into his loneliness and lit a candle in the dark. "No," he said softly. "Thank you. I'm Solomon." She tilted her head, confused. He smiled a real smile, the first in 2 years, and said, "You reminded me that I'm still alive." The crowd erupted into applause, but neither of them heard it. Emma curtsied once more and slipped back into the crowd, her heart pounding, her hands still tingling from where he'd held them. And Alexander stood alone again on the dance floor. But this time he didn't feel empty. He felt awake. By morning, the entire city knew. Billionaire CEO dances with Maid's daughter at charity gala. The headline blazed across news sites, gossip columns, social media feeds. Photos of Alexander and Emma mid-waltz circulated like wildfire, her small hand in his rare smile captured in crystal clear detail. Some called it heartwarming. Others called it a scandal. Inside Hamilton Tower, the executive boardroom crackled with tension. Shareholders sat around the long glass table, their faces tight with disapproval. Linda Mercer, Alexander's senior advisor and the company's chief strategist, stood at the head of the room, her tablet glowing with articles and Twitter threads. "This is a public relations nightmare," she said, her voice clipped. "The optics are terrible. A CEO dancing with a child employee. People are asking questions. Is he losing his grip? Is he becoming sentimental? Weak." One of the board members leaned forward. "We've spent years building the image of Hamilton Corporation as untouchable, disciplined, professional, and now this." Another chimed in. "It makes us look soft. Investors don't want soft, they want certainty." Linda's jaw tightened. "We need damage control. Immediately." "And what do you suggest?" Alexander's voice cut through the room like ice. He sat at the far end of the table, silent, until now his fingers steepled in front of him. Linda turned to face him. "We issue a statement, call it a charitable gesture, distance yourself from any personal implications. And," she hesitated, "we let the mother and daughter go, quietly, severance package, non-disclosure agreement, clean break." The room went still. Alexander didn't move. He just looked at her. "You want me to fire them? I want you to protect the company," Linda said firmly. "This is business, Alexander, not personal." Downstairs in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen, Martha Turner sat on a bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Emma stood beside her, pale and trembling. They'd been summoned an hour ago, told to wait. Martha hadn't said a word. She didn't need to. Emma could see it in her mother's eyes, the fear, the resignation, the quiet devastation. "I'm sorry, Mama," Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to. I didn't think—" "Shh." Martha reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. But they're going to fire us. I ruined everything." Martha shook her head. "You didn't ruin anything. You were kind. You were brave. And if they can't see that," her voice faltered, "then maybe this was never the right place for us anyway." Emma's tears spilled over. She'd only wanted to help, to remind someone lonely that they mattered. And now her mother was going to lose her job because of it. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Both of them looked up. Alexander Hamilton walked toward them alone, his expression unreadable. Martha stood immediately, pulling Emma up with her. They both lowered their heads. "Mr. Hamilton, sir," Martha began, her voice shaking. "I want to apologize on behalf of my daughter. She meant no disrespect. She's young and she didn't understand." "Stop." Martha froze. Alexander looked at Emma. "Do you know why I agreed to dance with you last night?" Emma shook her head, unable to speak. "Because you were the only person in that room who treated me like a human being." His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. "Everyone else saw a title, a bank account, a reputation. But you just saw someone standing alone, and you offered kindness." He turned to Martha. "Your daughter didn't embarrass me. She reminded me of something I'd forgotten." Martha's eyes widened. Alexander stepped closer. The board wants me to let you go. They say it's bad for business, bad for the company's image. He paused. But I didn't build this company by listening to people who've forgotten what matters. He looked directly at Emma. You don't need to apologize, I do. Emma blinked, confused. I'm sorry, Alexander said, that you live in a world where kindness is seen as a mistake, where reaching out to someone is considered inappropriate, where a 14-year-old girl has more courage than a room full of adults. He turned back to Martha. You're not being let go. In fact, I'd like to offer you a new position, managing the staff quarters and overseeing employee welfare. If you'll accept. Martha's breath hitched. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Yes. Thank you. Alexander nodded. Then he crouched slightly so he was eye level with Emma. Thank you, he said quietly, for the dance and for reminding me what it feels like to be seen. Emma wiped her eyes and gave a small trembling smile. From that day forward, something shifted. Alexander began visiting the staff quarters more often, not as a CEO conducting inspections, but as a man curious about the people who kept his world running. He learned their names, asked about their families, listened to their stories, and every Sunday evening when the estate was quiet, he would find Emma in the garden and ask, "May I have this dance?" And she would always say yes. 1 month later, Alexander Hamilton did something he'd never done before. He invited every employee of the Hamilton estate housekeepers, gardeners, drivers, kitchen staff, security guards to a formal appreciation dinner in the grand ballroom. The same ballroom where the gala had been held, the same floor where everything had changed, but this time the guests were different. Martha stood in the doorway, stunned. The ballroom had been transformed. Round tables draped in white linen filled the space. Candles flickered in glass holders. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, and at each place setting a small card read, "Thank you for all you do." Emma gripped her mother's hand. "Mama, is this real?" Martha couldn't speak. She just nodded, her eyes glistening. They entered slowly along with the others. People who had spent years working in silence, unseen and unheard, now walked into a space designed for them. Children ran between the tables, wide-eyed and laughing. Elderly staff members sat down carefully, as if afraid the chairs might disappear. No one had ever done this before. Alexander stood at the front of the room watching them settle in. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Linda had tried to talk him out of it. "This sets a precedent," she'd warned. "You can't treat employees like family." "Why not?" he'd replied. She had no answer. When everyone was seated, Alexander stepped onto the small stage. The room quieted. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. "Good evening," he began. His voice was calm, but it carried. "I know some of you are wondering why you're here, why I called this dinner, why I asked you to dress up and sit in a ballroom that for most of you has always been off limits." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces looking back at him. "A month ago, someone taught me something I should have known all along." He looked toward Emma, seated beside her mother near the middle of the room. "She reminded me that titles don't make us human. Money doesn't make us worthy. And kindness, real simple kindness, is the most powerful thing we have." Emma's cheeks flushed. She looked down at her hands. Alexander continued, "For too long I've lived inside walls. Walls built by grief, by expectation, by fear. I forgot what it meant to connect, to see people really see them as more than their function or their role." His voice softened. But one small act of courage changed that. A girl who had every reason to stay invisible chose instead to step forward. And in doing so, she cracked open something I thought was gone forever. He took a breath. "Tonight is not just a thank you dinner. Tonight is the beginning of something new." He gestured to the screen behind him. It lit up with a single image, a logo that read, "The Hamilton Heart Scholarship Fund." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Starting this year," Alexander said, "Hamilton Corporation will provide full scholarships to the children of every employee, covering education from middle school through college. No applications, no competitions. If you work here, your child has a future." The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others stood. A few began to cry. Martha covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emma stared at the screen, unable to process what she was hearing. Alexander held up a hand and the room quieted again. But that's not all, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. There's one more thing I'd like to do tonight. He stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward Emma's table. The crowd watched in silence. He stopped in front of her, his expression warm and gentle. Miss Emma Turner, he said, his voice carrying across the room. A month ago, you asked me a question that changed my life. Emma looked up at him, her heart pounding. Tonight, Alexander said, extending his hand, I'd like to ask you the same question. May I have this dance? Emma's breath caught. Her mother nudged her, gently smiling through her tears. Emma stood, her legs shaking, and placed her small hand in his. The orchestra began to play the same waltz from the gala. Alexander led her onto the floor and the crowd parted to give them space. This time Emma didn't stumble. She didn't count her steps. She simply followed her movements, light and sure. And as they turned beneath the chandeliers, Alexander leaned down and whispered, You taught me something, Emma. You taught me that no one is too poor to give a smile, and no one is too rich to learn kindness all over again. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shining. I just wanted you to know you weren't alone. I know, he said softly, and now neither are you. The music swelled, and then something beautiful happened. One by one, the other employees rose from their tables. Husbands took their wives' hands. Mothers danced with their children. Friends pulled each other onto the floor, laughing and spinning. The ballroom filled with movement, with music, with joy. And at the center of it all, a billionaire and a maid's daughter danced together, not as employer and employee, not as powerful and powerless, but as two people who had found each other in the loneliness and chosen connection over isolation. The crowd began to clap, slowly at first, then louder, until the entire room was applauding, not just for them, but for the moment itself, for the reminder that the most beautiful things in life cannot be bought. They can only be given. 3 months later, the first Hamilton Hart Scholarships were awarded. 12 children stood on a small stage in the estate's community hall, holding envelopes that contained their futures. Emma was among them. She wore a simple blue dress her mother had sewn by hand. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and when Alexander called her name, she walked forward with her head held high. He handed her the envelope and shook her hand just as he did with all the others. But when their eyes met, something passed between them, gratitude, respect, and something deeper, a quiet understanding that they had changed each other's lives. Congratulations, Emma, Alexander said warmly. Thank you, Mr. Hamilton, she replied, her voice steady now. The room erupted in applause. Martha stood in the back, tears running freely down her face, her hands pressed to her heart. Her daughter, her brave, beautiful daughter, was going to have the education she herself had never received. Martha's life had changed too. As the new director of staff welfare, she oversaw housing benefits and day-to-day operations for every employee on the estate. It was a role she'd never imagined holding. She worked from a small office near the main house with a window that overlooked the garden. Every morning she'd arrive early and make tea, still unable to believe this was her reality. Alexander often stopped by not to check on her work, but simply to talk. They'd discuss the staff's needs, upcoming projects, small improvements that could make life better for everyone. But sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, two people who had learned to see each other as equals. On weekends, Alexander began spending more time at the estate instead of traveling or working late. He'd walk the grounds with Emma, listening as she told him about her studies, her dreams, the books she was reading. He taught her about business, about leadership, about the weight of responsibility. She taught him about joy, about presence, about the small moments that make life worth living. They'd have dinner together sometimes, Alexander, Martha, and Emma, around the kitchen table in the staff quarters, eating simple meals and laughing over stories. For the first time in years, Alexander felt like he had a family again. Not by blood, but by choice. One Saturday afternoon, Emma approached Alexander with an idea. Mr. Hamilton, she said, a little nervous, I've been thinking, there are so many kids here on the estate, kids like me who've never had a chance to learn things like dance or music. Alexander nodded, encouraging her to continue. What if I started teaching them just once a week? Nothing fancy, just dancing. His face lit up. I think that's a wonderful idea. Really? Really? Within 2 weeks, the estate's old recreation hall had been cleared out and transformed. Mirrors were installed along one wall. A sound system was set up. Mats were laid down on the floor. And every Saturday at 3 o'clock, a dozen children gathered there giggling and stumbling over their feet while Emma, patient, kind, and glowing with purpose, taught them how to move. She showed them the waltz, the foxtrot, simple steps that made them feel elegant. But more than that, she taught them what her mother had taught her, that grace isn't about perfection. It's about showing up, about trying, about treating yourself and others with kindness. Alexander would sometimes stand in the doorway watching Emma guide a shy boy through a turn, watching her kneel down to tie a little girl's shoe, watching her laugh when they all got the steps wrong and decided to just spin in circles instead. And in those moments, he understood something profound. Healing doesn't happen alone. It happens when we let others in, when we give what we've been given, when we stop protecting our hearts and start sharing them. One evening, as the sun set over the garden, Alexander and Emma sat on a bench near the fountain. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent 2 years thinking I'd lost everything, that the best parts of my life were over." Emma looked at him. "But you showed me I was wrong," he continued. "The best parts weren't over. They were just waiting for me to be brave enough to step back onto the floor." Emma smiled. "You were never alone, Mr. Hamilton. You just needed someone to remind you." He nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, Emma, for everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way a daughter might with her father. "You're welcome," she whispered. And for the first time in years, Alexander Hamilton felt complete. Sometimes a dance is more than music and movement. It's a bridge between two souls who forgot they were looking for each other. Emma didn't ask Alexander Hamilton to dance because she wanted something from him. She asked because she saw someone standing alone in a crowded room, and she knew what loneliness felt like. And Alexander didn't say yes because he pitied her. He said yes because in that moment she reminded him that beneath the titles and the wealth and the grief, he was still human, still capable of connection, still worthy of kindness. We spend so much of our lives building walls, protecting ourselves from pain, from judgment, from vulnerability. But the truth is, we don't belong to the places we're born into or the roles we're given. We belong wherever kindness is welcomed, wherever courage is honored, wherever someone sees us, really sees us, and chooses to reach out anyway. Emma Turner stepped out of the shadows and into the light, not because she was fearless, but because she believed that one small act of grace could matter. And she was right. Thank you for listening to this story. I'm really curious, where are you right now and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Maid's Daughter Stories, where small hearts teach the world the biggest lessons. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask someone to dance.